Welcome to Series 1 of the Lost in Language podcast, hosted by me, Jessica Ball. This series aims to shine a light on communication approaches that can help us improve how we communicate and relate to ourselves, each other, and the world around us. Each approach is helping us get to the meaning beyond the words. So instead of ignoring, dismissing, arguing, or cancelling each other, we can get curious, create empathy, and improve understanding, whilst also developing skills that can help us think together in creative and generative ways. This episode, I talked to Arran Stibbe, Professor of Ecological Linguistics at the University of Gloucestershire. He has an academic background in both linguistics and human ecology and combines the two in his research and teaching. He is the founder of the International Ecolinguistics Association and author of Ecolinguistics, Language, Ecology and the Stories We Live By, and Econarrative, Ethics, Ecology and the Search for New Narratives to Live By. Ecolinguistics is the study of language and ecology, which allows us to uncover and highlight how language influences our behaviour that shapes decisions on whether we protect or destroy our environment. We explore the stories and narratives that are keeping us on a path towards ecological destruction, as well as how we can find and create new stories to live by. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, Arran, to the Lost in Language podcast. I'm really happy to be speaking with you today about ecolinguistics. Before we start, we're going to do a very quick check-in, and our check-in question is to share maybe just a memorable experience that you've had recently in nature.
Thanks for inviting me. Very pleased to be here with you. I think that is this morning. So this morning I went for a new walk with my dog. So this was exploring a path that I hadn't been on in years. And I just had this feeling that I was with an old friend when I was on this path and seeing the trees that I'd seen a long time ago. And those memories kind of flooded back. And it just made me realize how nature can be like a friend that you haven't seen for a long time, and just how warm and positive you feel when you see your friend again.
Thank you. Yeah, I really relate to that, nature being a friend. And I have some friends on my regular walks that I feel like I've also got to know over time. Um, so I think for me, a recent memorable experience in nature is just really enjoying all the summer skies in the evening, because I feel like there's something about summer where the sky feels so expansive, and I'm lucky enough to be on the third floor. And in the summer, I get the sunset, whereas in the winter, where I'm positioned, I get the sunrise, which I'm not always up for in the winter. But in the summer, it's really beautiful to watch these golden sunsets and to see these like vast, expansive skies, and just the beauty that is there for us to witness and be part of every single day. I think I'm really reminded of in the summer.
Yeah, that's lovely. And it is nice to see the changing skies and to
Mm.
like appreciate all of the different patterns and shades and contrasts and moods of the sky.
Thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed that check-in. So, for those people that are listening and they've never heard of ecolinguistics, can you just give us a brief overview of what it is and your kind of journey with it so far?
Yeah, so it's sometimes a little difficult to explain because it's about ecology and it's also about language, and people can't see the connection between the two at all. So I have this very quick way of saying it, that it's everything from looking at advertising and how the language in advertising encourages us to buy products that destroy the environment, right through to nature poetry and how it can encourage us to reconnect with the environment. So it's a very simplistic way just to get over this idea that obviously language and ecology are linked. Language influences our behavior decides whether we protect or destroy the environment.
And I think when I first discovered ecolinguistics, which was through a talk you gave at the Global Landscapes Forum when I was working there at the time, what really struck me was, it was bringing together so many threads of things that I was really interested in around values and behavior, and the way that power shows up and is enacted out through relationships and through choices, and structures. But I think also just really, really that heightened awareness of the power of language and words, and how those language and words are forming stories and narratives and discourse that we don't really appreciate how much they're shaping how we think about ourselves, how we think about other people and the more than human world. And and I think that's the thing that really struck me is even in kind of practices and processes that I work with as a facilitator, and we talk about how we communicate and how we think, we often forget that one last step between thinking and the meaning that is carried in language. So can you say a little bit about what you mean by stories from an eco-linguistic perspective? And what I'd really like to get into is obviously first some of those dominant stories that are governing our kind of mainstream discourse. And then, of course, some of these new stories that we can live by through eco-linguistics. But let's start first with power of a story and what we mean by story in eco-linguistics.
Yeah, certainly. So I would probably start this with Foucault. So Foucault was talking about discourse, and discourses, he say, they bring into being the objects which they purport to describe. So this is about language creating things rather than just describing things, because so much of our world, the real world that we're living in, is actually created through words. So things like a marriage. So a marriage doesn't exist except through words. Yeah, when you pronounce I now pronounce you husband and wife. Things like a university degree, that's just words on a piece of paper. Things like all of the positions like prime minister and all of the rest, these are just words. And there's so much socially constructed reality out there. And this reality has a real influence on our behavior and what we do and how we treat the natural world. Now, there are some discourse people who say everything is discourse, but I think that toothache will very clearly show you that not everything is discourse. So I have a kind of a realistic position of the world where, yes, there's many things that exist beyond words, and we just need to go for a walk like I did this morning and see all of these beings around us that are existing beyond our words. But also, a lot of the reality that we're in is shaped by words. And I use the term stories to mean structures in our minds that are influencing how we think, how we talk, and how we act. And so these stories are coming from the society around us. They're stories that collectively we live by. There's kind of individual cognition, but it's also social cognition, which is all of these minds coming together. And it's like society as a whole is thinking. Society as a whole has values and beliefs. And these come through in the form of stories.
Mm. And I think in your book, you talk about how some of our old stories are crumbling. And I think we can see that in in two ways. One is this kind of increased division we see between different cultures, different groups of people, different ways of thinking about the world. And that is the story that we're telling ourselves about the world and the story that we're telling ourselves about ourselves in the world and other people. Also, I think there's so much hope, like there's so much fertile ground where we're seeing these stories being challenged around productivity, around inclusion, and people kind of collectively and creatively contributing to new stories. But whether they're doing that with an awareness or an eco-linguistics lens, I'm not sure. And I mean, I think eco-linguistics could support the development of those emergent stories or those stories that have previously been erased. Um, but what is it do you think like what one mainstream narrative shall we kind of start with as together as we're looking at how that's impacting the world right now? I mean, there are some sort of very dominant ones around infinite growth on a finite planet, or nature as a resource to be exploited. So how are those playing out in our lives, and how is language allowing that to continue?
Yeah, so I'd say we have a dominant industrial culture, and that culture and all the ideologies that make it up have spread around the world. And that culture, those ideologies, the stories, are destructive in the sense that they're putting us on a path towards ecological destruction. And you mentioned a couple already, but I think that's pretty growth is probably a good one to start with. We've seen that recently in the UK with the election, and that nearly all the major political parties were saying, we're not going to borrow any more money, we're not going to raise taxes, but we are going to make everyone's lives better by spending more. And the only way they can square that circle is through saying, economic growth, we're going to grow the economy, we are going to be making more products, we're going to be buying more products. And that will lead to a little bit leftover taxes that we can then use to benefit people's lives. And the problem with that is that if we're making more things and buying more things, then firstly, we have to work very hard. Secondly, we might be consuming a lot more stuff than we actually need, which could have a negative effect. If you consume too much food, you get fat. You know, if there are too many cars, then we have traffic jams and air pollution. But also, it's ecologically destructive. If we're producing all of this stuff, then it is destroying the earth. So we really have to think, isn't there a better way of paying for hospitals and schools and police than selling masses and masses of stuff and creating this culture that is based on this frenzy of accumulation?
Mm. Yeah, and I think one way that this has also been framed, I guess, from a more um, sort of individual way maybe first is this story of separation. So it's something that I've come across a lot is that people pinpoint the sort of development of Western science and Western religion as when we started to separate from nature, when we started to look at things reduced to their smallest part and forget that lose sight of this interconnected and interrelated whole. Can you say a bit more about kind of your own understanding of this story of separation and in terms of our relationship to nature and then this more mechanistic industrialized world that we've come to create?
Yeah, and you could probably start with the great chain of being. So Aristotle's idea and many other cultures' idea that you have like rocks and minerals that are at the bottom of the great chain of being, and their purpose is to provide nutrition for the plants. And the purpose of the plants is to provide nutrition to the animals. And the purpose of the animals is to provide nutrition and labor for the humans. And that humans are right at the top of the
Mm.
chain. So this is kind of human exceptionalism, human superiority. And then humans get to be seen as separate from everything else. Everything else is a resource for humans to use as much as they want of um, to benefit their lives. And then you have like sustainable development discourse, which says, wait a sec, you can't just like take everything from the natural world because then it will be destroyed, that you need to have sustainable consumption. But the problem is the story is still the same, that the rocks, the plants, the animals are all there for humans. We just have to use them in more sustainable ways.
Mm.
So a lot of environmentalism, a lot of sustainability discourse isn't really challenging this fundamental idea of humans as separate from the environment, and the environment is a supermarket that provides all of the goods that humans need.
Mm. And as someone who has worked quite a bit in international development, I can, yeah, confirm that the language is still very much ecosystem services, payment for ecosystem services. So really looking as, yeah, nature as this provider and not nature as something that has the intrinsic right to live and exist without humans. And so obviously we can draw a lot of inspiration as ecolinguistics from indigenous language and indigenous cultures. Do you have an example of kind of an indigenous story that gives us the alternative to this human exceptionalism that we see in our dominant Western discourse?
Yeah, so I've been looking at Native American ways of performing ecocultural identity. So I would say ecocultural identity is where you see yourself as part of a human group, but also as a part of a group that includes not just humans, but also beings from the more than human world. And there's various linguistic ways that these ecocultural identities are performed. For example, with pronoun use, if you use the pronoun we, And within the we, you are including not just humans, but also other beings. Then that includes us and other beings within the same group. It overcomes the story of separation.
Thank you. And then so in your course, which I think everyone should do when they have the time, the stories we live by, you talk about these 9 different forms that stories take and how we can kind of become ecolinguists. And I really wanted to just highlight evaluation and conviction in terms of these dominant discourses and how that is contributing to further division in society.
Yeah, so in my book, which is called Ecolinguistics, and the Stories We Live By free online course, I do talk about these 9 different types of story. Now, you could have more types of story, you could have fewer types of story. So it's a little bit arbitrary, but it is useful to think about these different kinds of story. And one of them is evaluations. And evaluations are stories in people's minds that something is either good or bad. It's really very simple, but it's very fundamental because humans often are quite polarized and we think of these things are good, these things are bad. You can see it in elections. This party is good, this party is bad. But if you look at it more closely, you'll find actually there's some bad things in the party you think is good, and there's some good things in the party you think is bad, that nothing's ever so black and white. But I think in terms of our cognition, we tend to think of things favorably or unfavorably in quite a binary kind of way. And that's reflected in our language. So something like happy or unhappy. Happy is positive and unhappy is negative. That's just built into the language. So what we call marked terms. So unhappy is marked, it's got the un on it. And these tend to be the negative ones, like convenient or inconvenient. The inconvenient is a negative one. So it's a very simplistic way of thinking about the world. And it's very useful to look at these evaluations and think, well, are they useful? So something like convenient is good as an evaluation. Is this useful? When you look at it, it does tend to end up with convenience food, which is unhealthy and has lots of plastics and is bad for the environment. Convenience, so everyone wants to go in their cars. And we tend to leave out the fact that, to have your cars and your, washing machines and all the labor saving devices in your house, you actually have to work, maybe doing a job that you don't like for many, many hours. That's never seen as inconvenient, but, going out and cutting the grass or whatever, that's seen as inconvenient. So we've got to get a plastic lawn. So yeah, just questioning these things. So something like fast is good. So a fast car is better than a slow car. And you say, well, actually, do we need cars that go at 140 miles an hour? Aren't we just building in a lot of extra components that we don't need and destroying the environment? So just questioning these evaluations that are so much part of our culture.
And this one, I think I can really see being questioned and being played out in many social media memes around, yeah, why do I have to go to work and yeah, for 9 to 5, for very little pay and not enjoy nature and not enjoy spending time with friends. And I think there's a real pushback now around kind of 4-day working weeks, 6-hour working days, flexible working. So people waking up to this realization that what they've been measuring good against is not necessarily good for their well-being or for the well-being of the planet. So I suppose the question is who's controlling, or how has that measure of good and bad evolved within our society? And is it that someone has consciously created that, or is it just sort of collective evolution geared towards, yeah, I guess, growth and materialism and consumerism and consumption? Is it just sort of, or do you think it's more intentional than that?
I think that things arise and are influenced by the dominant culture. And then they get codified into the language. And then they get kind of solidified in the language. Because like happy and unhappy, you're never going to like change that around. So things do get kind of fossilized in the language, and you have to go to a lot of effort to like try and so actually, we should think of slow as good, small as good, and actually go to some real effort to overcome them.
Yeah, definitely. I'm a huge advocate of slow is good. One other of these forms of stories that I wanted to touch on was erasure, and I guess identity as well, because I'm really interested in identity, and I guess how we form our identities through our values and beliefs, or and more intrinsic things, or how we form them through extrinsic things like status or power or money. But when I was preparing for this, I was just reflecting on the nature of language to label us willingly or unwillingly in some way around our identity. And I was thinking of the term tree hugger, because and I am someone who has a tree friend, and I enjoy going and spending time with my tree friend and hugging my tree friend, and how this term has been used in a very derogatory way towards environmentalists over many decades now. That the origin of it was actually in a kind of small rural women indigenous community in India who were trying to protect the trees and the land that they loved and that they were connected to, and that story has been somewhat erased. So the plight of those women, those marginalized women, not many people are aware of, and yet we are using this term in a negative way. But again, I think that's something that's changing and shifting as more people become environmentally aware. But can you say a little bit more about how erasure is used as a form of story? Because I think it's really important when we think about um, marginalized voices and power dynamics.
Yeah, so erasure is representing something as unimportant or unworthy of consideration. And erasure depends on what you think should be there. So it depends on the analyst. So for ecolinguists, we think that animals and plants and forests and rivers should be visible, should be like represented in discourse. So if we find a particular discourse, like let's say the discourse of the Sustainable Development Goals, we look at this discourse and we see that, oh, it's not actually talking about animals and plants and forests and rivers. It's talking about ecosystem services, and it's talking about sustained and sustainable economic growth. And it's talking about industrialization. Well, it's not. It's talking about sustainable industrialization. And it's not like coming down to the real basics and making animals and plants visible and making you want to care about them.
Mm.
So we look at a discourse, we notice that something that we really believe should be there has been erased, is just not present. And then it's about calling that out and saying, well, actually, this should be there. These beings are important in themselves and for the future of life on the planet, and they should be represented in the discourse.
And I think one really important word for me there is care, that we should care about these beings, these plants, these animals, the soil, the water, the rivers. And that kind of leads me to the erasure of our feelings. I think through the creation of this dominant discourse, our feelings have been overlooked or dismissed or deemed something that we should be almost ashamed of. And of course, without our feelings, then it is very easy to allow this harmful behavior to continue because we're numb to it. So the erasure of our feelings, I think, is a really important part of this kind of storytelling and this narrative. And I think, again, something that seems to be coming back into different discourses. People are reclaiming a space for their feelings and the legitimization of their feelings in how they navigate through the world and how they see themselves in the world. And I used to say when I was looking at emotional sustainability as an agent of change, like that you could be believed to think that your feelings are standing in the way of this progress, this kind of, constant growth, because really when we connect to them and we ask ourselves, yeah, like, is this really convenient or not? Does this really feel good for me to be rushing around in my car eating junk food and working really hard? No, it doesn't feel good. So I wanted maybe now to shift to looking at ecolinguistics as this form of resistance. And maybe just briefly to touch on social ecology, because that's something that I really resonate with. So can you say a little bit about what a social ecologist might believe?
Yeah, so social ecology says that we are not going to solve any of the ecological problems until we solve the problems of hierarchy in human society. That if we have billionaires with their yachts and their tower blocks and their private jets, and then we have people who are struggling to survive, then we're never going to build a sustainable world. And that you need to have a massive reduction in the amount that the rich are consuming and create a much more equal society so that the people who don't have enough will have enough, even as overall the amount we consume massively decreases. And the problem is that something like sustainable development discourse will never say that the super rich have to consume less. It's always that everyone has to consume sustainably. This word sustainable is just like put in sustainable consumption. And that's usually represented as recycling and efficiency and alternative energy, never less. And so we're never actually going to solve the ecological issues unless we can solve the inequality issues and create a more equal, caring society.
Mm. And something that you also talk about is the narrative of like technology as like the thing that will save us, which I think we see being played out, particularly with some of these billionaires that are trying to do like chemical weather engineering, um, and very large scale agriculture, industrial agriculture, things that they or carbon capture technology. I mean, I can't believe that we're investing billions of pounds or dollars into carbon capture technology when we have soil and the ocean and trees that capture carbon for us if we just treat them well. So, I mean, how is it that we've got this quite, I would say, advancing narrative around technology being the answer? And again, like that is erasing nature and people in it. So, why do you think that's so attractive to some people?
Well, we do have this story that progress is good, and then progress is defined as technological progress. And it is kind of quite miraculous what technology has achieved, in the sense of sending people to the moon and just the incredible power that is in your phone and AI now. And it's just quite amazing. And people think that because it has this incredible power that it can be used to save the world. But the thing is that the technology doesn't matter at all. What matters is how we use the technology. Unless you have an absolute revolution and change in what technology is being used for, then technology is always just going to be used to make people richer at the expense of humans and the environment.
Mm,
So it's really a distraction. So it's not that alternative energy is useless or electric cars are useless or anything like that. That is a real distraction from what fundamentally needs to change, which is the entire mindset and the entire system that the world runs by. Unless that changes, technology can't do anything.
yeah. And I think this is something that I'm particularly interested in is this kind of mechanistic language that is very dominant, and that how that is sort of framing human beings as almost having this human machine identity, and the way that we use that through organizations and yeah through media. So thinking about people in organizations needing to be productive and efficient and consistent like a machine would be, whereas human beings, we can't be those things because we're natural. So like the natural world, we change with the different seasons, with the different times, how we feel, how we're feeling physically, mentally, emotionally. We are not machines. We can't turn up every day the same, and the harm that that has on us mentally and emotionally. So I'm really interested in that. And I think the productivity narrative is something that I've been trying to separate myself from for years because it's so dominant. And when I first started noticing this, it was because I had this sense and this need to just be as opposed to do. So when we're looking at, I guess, again, these kind of polarities of like being and doing, and we're so used to doing because we're told that we need to be productive all the time, and that productivity is somehow linked to our value. in terms of like society or our organization. And so who are we when we're just being? And what does that like good? I asked myself this question of like, what is good quality being? And then over the years, kind of tried different ways to really separate myself from this need, even if it was a need that I didn't want to impose on myself of having to be productive all the time and not feeling guilty when I wasn't productive, whatever that means. And then a couple of years ago, I was expressing this to my friend and saying, like, I really just want to do nothing, but I feel guilty all the time. And she said to me, well, why don't you just call it something else? So I was like, okay. And I think this is where ecolinguistics really like plays such a profound and creative role in our lives, because just by giving me this suggestion or this permission, well, call it something else. And then the next day I was just sitting on my balcony and suddenly I was like, worm time, I'm going to call it worm time. And then the words for worm time came out of me very naturally. So I was like, okay, well, worm time, formerly known as doing nothing, it's actually a period of creative rest where we can metabolize our experiences, compost our thoughts and feelings, and turn over new ideas. And so for me, this is a period when, and it can take different forms, but it's acknowledging that in our very busy, overwhelming, complex lives, sometimes we need to take the time to integrate that. So I need to like really metabolize and digest, what have I experienced and break that down and understand it. And then composting is the letting go of the things that don't serve me anymore, like the thoughts and feelings that perhaps I don't want to take with me, and then breaking, composting and the good, don't want to evaluate it in those terms, feelings from that experience, and using that as fertile, nutritious, like mulch for new growth. And this turning over is this like creativity. So in order to have this creative mind, I'm like turning things over in my mind, looking at them from different angles. So this really came to me, and like it's something that has quite transformed my life, because it sort of released me from that guilt. So when I'm like, oh well, now I know I need worm time, and then I just give myself worm time because I know that all those other things are happening internally in me, so that there is like a richness. It's not like I'm not doing anything, but I'm giving myself what I need in order to be like more to when I am productive, to make sure that that's like really generative. So that was kind of an eco-linguistics experience in action in my real life. And is there kind of anything that you can say about process? Obviously, it's using metaphor, which is another one of these ways to tell stories. But what's kind of your response to my worm time?
Yeah, well, I heard about your worm time a couple of years ago, and I think it's a wonderful metaphor, and I do use it myself because I have like a standing desk, and with a standing desk, you can stand for a while, but then your legs start to hurt a bit. And then what I do is I lie down in bed and I just close my eyes and I just do nothing. Although now it's formerly known as nothing, now it's worm time. And this is an extremely good way of dealing with it because then all of the thoughts and ideas just like get clarified. And the you can turn the shit into something positive. So, I think it's a very useful way of using metaphor to rethink something which is negatively described by society and rethink it in a positive way,
Mm.
reframing, finding new metaphors, new stories to live by. That's really what ecolinguistics is about.
Yeah. And the other reason I really love it is because obviously it brings in the story of the worm and the soil. And this is the thing that we often, again, overlook, it's erased, is that we're walking on this earth every day, and this earth, is made of soil that formed over billions of years, and it's got more life in 1 teaspoon of healthy soil than people on the planet. So this incredible, like mysterious, collaborative ecosystem of organisms that are living symbiotically beneath our feet and working so hard for us. to be able to grow food. And obviously, we know that we have a crisis of fertile topsoil, that we know that monoculture has eroded and removed the nutrients from our soil. So we do have this crisis with soil. And so to bring people's awareness also not only to their own inner system and what's happening themselves and what they need, but again, connecting it to nature and this kind of reciprocal relationship that we have. And I think that's why ecolinguistics versus just linguistics is so important, because it's inclusive of the more than human world and our like the fact that our life depends on this reciprocal relationship that we are currently degrading and destroying. And within ecolinguistics, I know that each kind of ecolinguist develops their own ecosophy or ecological philosophy. So would you be able to just share, and I don't know if that's something that changes over time, so whether you've had more than one ecosophy, or whether when you find it, you think, no, that's it, that's how I want to analyze all text through the lens of this. So can you talk a little bit about how you developed your own ecosophy and what it is?
Yeah, sure. So when you're doing ecolinguistics, or actually any kind of critical analysis, you're saying that certain forms of language are good and certain forms of language are bad. In ecolinguistics, certain stories are beneficial and certain stories are destructive. And it's very important to have some criteria for deciding whether a story is beneficial or destructive. I mean, if you're working with racism, say, then it's pretty obvious a racist story is destructive and an anti-racist story is beneficial. But in the ecological sphere, things are much more complicated. You have different needs and that need to be balanced with each other. You have a vast range of different kind of beings. You have different life expectancies and very short lives and very long lives. And you have ecosystems and you have individuals. And it's a really complicated system. So it's very important to be aware as an analyst of your criteria that you're saying that this is destructive and this is beneficial. So all of us have an ecosophy, which is your ecological philosophy. It's your set of criteria for deciding whether something's positive or negative. But a lot of people, they don't reflect on it and they don't express it. And so I found it very useful to express an ecosophy in a simple way, just like a few bullet points to explain how we're judging the stories against, or what we're judging the stories against. So our actual ecosophy is more than the bullet points. We have a very deep kind of philosophy of our ideas of the ideal relationship between humans and other beings and the physical environment. And it is something that changes over time. So you have to acknowledge that the ecosophy as written down is a simplification. So yeah, it does change over time because we're exposed to different philosophies we find out there. Maybe we've never read about deep adaptation. We read deep adaptation, our worldview changes, our ecosophy changes. So it changes over time, depending on what we read and our experience with nature. And the last time I expressed my ecosophy, I did it as one word, and that word was living, with an exclamation mark. And the exclamation mark means that living is something to be respected and celebrated and protected. It just means, yay, living. This is the thing that is morally important for us.
Mm.
But just one word, that's not enough. You need to kind of explain it. So living is humans and all species living with high well-being. It's not just about survival, because you could say, well, those pigs in the factory farm, they're living, but no, they're not living with high well-being. So it's about living, all species living with high well-being, and not just now, but also into the future. Because you could create like a wonderful society where everyone is equal and everyone's needs are met, and that's great. But if it's an unsustainable society on a path towards destruction, where everyone's going to die in a few years because you're overusing the resources, that's not great. So yeah, it has to go into the future. And then that brings in the idea of environmental limits. that if this living with high well-being is going to continue into the future, then we have to stay within environmental limits. And then that brings us on to social justice, because we've already exceeded so many environmental limits that we need a massive reduction in the amount we consume. But there's people in poverty who need to increase their consumption. So social justice says that the very rich must reduce their consumption massively while the very poor increase their consumption. So that's kind of the bullet points of the ecology, but there's much more. There's a deeper side to it as well.
And I think what's really important to note there is, like you say, that it changes over time. And as a dialogue practitioner, it just reminds me of what we say about opinions, that our opinion is just an assumption based on our life experience until that point. So I'm going to have new life experiences and I'm going to integrate them and perhaps form new opinions, and so that nothing is static or rigid. And stories are like that too. Like, stories can change over time, meaning can change over time, because we are integrating and becoming aware of this new information, new experiences, new knowledge, and taking that on board and just constantly changing. So it's a very creative process. So do you have some examples of kind of creativity within ecolinguistics that you particularly enjoy and like?
Well, creativity is essential, because the idea is that we look at the stories of industrial civilization that aren't working, that are putting us on a path towards destruction, and we have to find new stories to live by. One route for finding new stories to live by is to look at traditional cultures around the world and indigenous cultures around the world, because these cultures existed before fossil fuels. They existed in fragile environments. They had to be sustainable, otherwise they would die out. So there were traditional cultures which have remained for thousands of years. These are great places to look for new stories to live by. But we can also be creative, and we can create new stories to live by. And we can look at the failing stories of our current civilization, and we can just do the polar opposite. So let's create stories which give animals, humans, ecosystems intrinsic value. Let's look for stories which are based around happiness rather than economic growth. And, any of these stories of industrial civilization, it's use our creativity to create new stories to live by.
And I think that as a facilitator really speaks to me in how important it is to bring people together to co-create those stories, or for people to have the agency to share those stories. And I think agency is, and we talk about that in some of the structures of language, if someone has agency or if sensing power, or is passive within that story. And I think this part of the story that I'm seeing and feel part of is lots of people feel passive and without agency and without power to affect change. But actually, by changing the way that we use language, by raising our awareness, by being intentional, and by storytelling, which is something that's so unique to human beings, that so much of our ancestry existed just orally, that we were oral human beings before we invented alphabet and written language. And so much of our culture and knowledge, it would have been passed through oral tradition. So storytelling runs through our blood, like, I think wherever we're from in the world, however far we might feel from that ancestry. So is there any kind of, do you have any tips or sort of recommendations for people to go about kind of collectively creating these new stories?
I think that it's important to look at traditional stories from around the world, not because you're going to take those stories and you're going to appropriate those stories, but what you can do is you can look at these stories and the type of language which conveys them, and then you can use similar forms of language in your creativity. So one of the things I did was a grammar of ecocultural identity. So all of the linguistic devices and metaphors that have been used in Native American cultures to express solidarity and belonging to the natural world. And you can use those metaphors and those linguistic devices in creating these new stories to live by. So drawing not directly on the stories of other cultures, but on the ways that, you know, relationships are expressed in these cultures, and that can be very powerful.
One of those ways is obviously the use of verbs and nouns. So we see more kind of verbs used in Indigenous language that they give animacy to nature. So the way that they talk about river versus the river. So can you say a little bit more about how, yeah, some of these Indigenous languages give that life, that living with the exclamation mark to nature through the structure and use of their language?
Okay, well, I think it's quite important to distinguish between an indigenous language and the kind of the deep grammar of that language, and the way that the words of the language are put together into stories. Because what we can't do is to start engineering English and changing the deep English grammar to be more like an indigenous grammar. So we're not going to be able to change categories of nouns to verbs. We're not going to be able to change our pronoun set. People have been working so hard to create like a new pronoun that means he or she, and so hard to have a new pronoun that we can use for animals and humans. So Robin Wall-Kimmerer says we should talk about ki and kin for animals. Instead of he and she, we should say ki and kin. But it's very hard to change the deep structures of the grammar of your language.
Mm.
So it's not really at the level of the language, it's at the level of the discourse. So the particular metaphors, the particular kinds of pronoun use, the particular combinations of linguistic features that are used to convey this enchantment with the natural world, and using those in English, and using them to be inspiring.
Mm.
So one example might just be about the kind of verbs that are used around animals. So Rachel Carson would, when she's talking about fish, she would say things like, the salmon knew the rivers that they were born in, and they followed these rivers. And so these salmon are knowing things and they're doing things. So this is representing them as beings who have mental lives and beings who have purposes and destinations and beings who are actively involved in the world. And so we can use that kind of grammar in new stories to live by to represent fish as beings with intrinsic worth.
Mm.
Whereas if you look at environmental discourse, they just would talk about fish stocks or fishery species and things like that.
Mm. And I think being able to see ourselves in that intrinsic worth as humans as well, to be part of nature. And then when we give back that value and worth to the more than human, it's reflected back to us. Because that, I think that's why I really resonate with social ecology, because I see that as humans, we've lost agency, we've lost our sensing ability in the world, we've lost our ability to truly feel the full spectrum of human emotions. And um, so I think by gifting that back, to all of nature, to see it as this alive, vibrant, beautiful, wondrous thing that we can then see that we are reflected in that too. And that can give us some hope and some kind of a source of power, I think, hopefully, to be creative and to come together and to deeply care once more for our home. Um,
Yeah, so there's something which, when people say, what does it mean to be human?
mm,
And then often the answer is, well, what it means to be human is what distinguishes us from other animals. Maybe we have language, maybe we have a sense of history, maybe we have religion, maybe you have rationality. And that separates us from humans. This is what makes us human. Sorry, this separates us from other animals. This is what makes us human and makes us superior to other animals and to nature. But I think that this is a very fragile way of basing our feeling of superiority, because we know we're not actually superior to other animals. And what we could do instead is say, well, what makes us human? Well, it's also the things that we share with other animals. So we share social bonds, we share, loving our children, we share living within an environment, we share emotions. So all of those things that we share with other animals, we should celebrate those, and we should find our sense of self-worth through being animals the same as other animals, and finding all animals, worthy, rather than separating us off for these small, unique things that we have. All animals have some unique things about them that other animals don't have.
Mm. And I think this is really where the slowness comes in, because unless we slow down and intentionally choose to look at every living thing having its own unique worth and role in the ecosystem, it's very easy, as I have recently discovered through my relationship with my birds, is to just impose a socially constructed hierarchy onto nature and start evaluating some species as better or than others. So, my imposed hierarchy of the pigeon, magpie, and crow, which then I felt quite heartbroken about, because I want to see that pigeon as beautiful and as worthy as the kind of more mythical crow and magpie. So I think for me that was quite a realization of just how powerful these structures and systems of thought are within us culturally, which and why I think it, as much as we can look to indigenous cultures as inspiration, we cannot really draw on them too much, because that's thousands of years of culture that's evolved over time, that's embedded and embodied within the people within that culture, in the same way that we are carrying our cultural like evolution within us. So we have to be so creative, I think, to really transform our culture and our systems and structures of thought and meaning to something that can be and draw inspiration from these more um, non-hierarchical, inclusive, reciprocal ways of being in the world.
Yeah, yeah. So something like, pigeons. There's this story that pigeons are vermin, or they're pests, or they are common, that they're not interesting. And it's a very deeply embedded story. But then if you have like a book like, what was it called? Field Notes from a Hidden City by Esther Wolfson. And in this book, she just talks about pigeons, and she talks about them in a very inspiring way that really makes you see them as individuals living their own lives for their own purposes, as being, beings that have feelings and intelligence. And it really encourages a deep respect for pigeons. So I'd encourage you to read that book if
Yeah, I
you
will.
haven't
I
already.
definitely will read that book as I continue in my relationship building with pigeons. And I think again, it just reflects back what I see in kind of human relationships, is that we're drawn to people that we want to identify with for whatever reason, and then we tend to exclude those people that perhaps we don't identify with, or we feel some kind of dissonance or conflict with. Um, and it is really deeply rooted in our identity and our values and our beliefs and our stories about who we are in the world and who we want to be. So that's why I just think it's so powerful to use nature as that kind of reflective mirror of, well, how am I showing up in the world, and to constantly challenge ourselves to show up with more reciprocity and with more kind of sense of this inclusive, caring, alive community of all human and non-human beings. And something that you've said to me before about ecolinguistics is that we have to give people something positive to transform towards. So if we know that we're in a period of change, that the old stories are kind of dying, we're in this sort of regenerative, fertile, creative, but also conflict-ridden part of human and the more than human history. So I think ecolinguistics and these new stories are a way to really give people something to transition towards. And I guess we go back to metaphor and this kind of spatial metaphor of going forward being good. But yeah, can you just say a little bit then, I guess, about the things that you're currently working on that provide people that kind of hope and that thing to transition towards?
Yeah, so this is important because a lot of criticism, and you can kind of see it in the name, is negative criticism. And in linguistics, this is quite fundamental because something like critical discourse analysis is about revealing the hidden processes of oppression. It's from neo-Marxism, a kind of false consciousness, that once you make people aware of the ways that language is oppressing them, then they can resist. And it kind of stops there. It's like, you know, you're being oppressed by this kind of racist language. And once you're aware of that, then you can overcome that and you can like work towards anti-racism. But then Jim Martin came along and said, no, we can't just be negative. We also have to look for positive discourses, discourses that represent the world that we want to build. So you can't just critique the negative, the racist, sexist, ecologically destructive discourses, but you also have to search for positive new stories to live by, new discourses. So that's positive discourse analysis. And it's very important that we do that. It's also very joyful as well to do that. So
Mm.
at the moment, I'm looking at intimacy and enchantment at the end of the world. So I'm looking at apocalyptic stories, films, cartoons, and how they represent what happens as the end times are nearing. And are the people just fighting and killing each other and just going crazy, or are they finding some kind of intimacy and enchantment with a world that is about to be lost? My idea, of course, is that we don't need to wait until the end times. That actually would be quite good right now to find that intimacy and enchantment.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you saw the film Don't Look Up,
Yeah.
um, but how can I do this without giving spoilers? But anyway, there's this huge comet that is heading towards the Earth. And the final scene where the comet is about to strike, people aren't like fighting with each other. It's not like hatred and people stealing things and stabbing and raping. So it's the family are sitting around the table, sharing a moment of intimacy and laughing and telling stories and having this real closeness before the end.
Mm.
I just think that's a nice image. And so perhaps what we don't need is a frenzy of accumulation and lots of stuff. We need this kind of intimacy with each other and intimacy with nature and some enchantment in our lives.
Mm. And it's just making me think of a few other things like the film about the story of the plane crash from Uruguay and how they were, in that plane in the mountain and that scene where they're reciting poems to each other. And this question that you asked earlier of like, what does it really truly mean to be human? And how actually in these times of real crisis, we saw it in the pandemic as well with the kind of coming together and the kindness, these times of real crisis and how it does bring out what it means to be human in some ways that is quite mundane. And I say that with a love for that word of kind of the connection to earth and intimacy, like this mundane intimacy that I really, really love and maybe that is what it means to be human, to kind of be creative, to be intimate, to be enchanted with the world. But why is it, yeah, that we have to be faced with a real crisis to make us stop and really appreciate that? And I think there is some hope in using our creativity and creating these new stories that can really make us realize that we can have that experience of what it means to be human now. Although we are still facing crisis, but I suppose not to the point of it's going to happen tomorrow. Although of course it is happening as we speak in many parts of the world. Um, so yeah, I think that's really important. Can you say a little bit about the AI project that you're also involved in?
Yeah, sure. So this is very interesting from an ecolinguistics perspective So the new large language models, ChatGPT and Bard and Copilot and all of these, they provide answers to questions by surveying a vast amount of data that is out there on the internet. So what they tend to do is they pick up the dominant stories that we live by when they're providing the answers. So if you type in something like, tell me about patio heaters. So patio heaters are these heaters you have outdoors. Of course, they're not very efficient because there's no insulation at all. The heat just like disappears. But that's not what it will tell you. So if you ask ChatGPT about, tell me about patio heaters, they say, this is a fantastic means to extend your living space and connect with your friends in an outdoor environment where you can experience nature, and you can purchase this kind and this kind from this website and this website. It just gives you this commercial story. This is based on, of course, the whole capitalist system of you have to sell people stuff that they don't need so that the economy can grow. And there's so much stuff out there which is advertising the benefits of patio heaters. So that's what it picks up. And so the Harmony project is designed to put a filter in there. So it will say, don't look at these commercial sites about patio heaters. Look at ecological sites, which are talking about the problems with patio heaters. And don't do this both sidism thing where on the one hand, patio heaters provide a fantastic outdoor environment and it can extend your home and provide intimacy. But on the other hand, they destroy the world. So don't do that kind of both sidism and thing. Make sure that the responses are honest and harmless and promote harmony with the earth.
Yeah, it's a very exciting project. And I don't know if you can remember the quote that was shared with us the other day about the ecolinguistics AI's definition of photosynthesis, because before AI it had given like a factory metaphor, and after it had learned ecolinguistics.
Yeah, I can remember that. So it was, give me a metaphor for photosynthesis. So it comes up with photosynthesis is like a factory that takes in it would take in carbon dioxide and it would add carbon dioxide to the biomass of the plant or whatever like that. And then after training the Harmony model, it said photosynthesis is the earth breathing life into the future,
Mm.
which is a little bit better.
Yeah, just a bit. Really, yeah, so powerful. Are there any other resources or things that you would recommend to people who are interested in ecolinguistics and want to find out more, or want to connect with other ecolinguists?
Yeah, certainly. So there's the Stories We Live by free online course. And this has been taken by about 4,000 people. It's been very popular. We've done research on it that has shown that it changes people's lives and their professional practice. We can demonstrate exactly how it's changed their lives. It's made people more critical of the texts that surround them, more appreciative of the natural world. It's influenced their behavior and it's influenced their actions in terms of promoting ecological issues. So we've developed all this evidence of how this course changes people's lives. So I really encourage people to do the course.
Mm.
There's also the International Ecolinguistics Association, which is free to join. So we do have this kind of, in ecolinguistics, that everything is free. So all of our resources are free in the association and the course. And we've got a free journal and a free bibliography. And please do join the International Ecolinguistics Association.
Yeah, definitely. So as we draw to a close, I just wanted to give a moment for you to maybe share anything that you think we've missed or any other questions you'd like to explore before we have a checkout.
Well, I mean, I would just say narrative that within the world of linguistics, narrative tends to be overlooked because narrative is seen as something that literature people do. And there's like
Mm.
long, complicated things that go across books. But actually, narrative is absolutely fundamental to who we are as human beings. That, as you were saying earlier, that the intergenerational transfer of knowledge and understanding around the world has always been through narratives. Narratives are extremely powerful ways of conveying not just facts, but also emotions and attitudes to people. And so I've been exploring eco-narratives, and my latest book is called Econarrative. And I would just really, encourage people to investigate narratives as an incredibly powerful force for good or bad, and let's make sure it's good.
Mm. And when you say investigate, I is there a difference then, I guess, about what we've been talking about with stories and narrative? Because narrative, I guess, is this kind of sequential time and event, um, and it has characters, like you said. So we sometimes talk about being the leading character in your own life. Um, how does that form as we kind of go through our lives? And are you saying that so much of our personal narrative is shaped by these external kind of socially constructed narratives and forces at play? And how do we sort of rewrite our own narrative?
Yeah, so I should be clear that when we were talking about stories earlier, this was about these worldviews that are in people's minds that influence how they think, talk, and act. And with narratives, there's many different ways that the term is used, but I was meaning it in the sense that you were talking about a sequence of logically connected events that happen over time and involve characters and locations. And they don't just appear in novels, they appear in advertisements and they appear in creation stories. And they appear in science and they appear all around us. And they things that we need to focus on a lot. And Anthony Giddens talks about narrative as a story of self, that who we are as people is a particular story that we keep ongoing. And that, if you say, tell me about yourself, you will come up with a narrative that constructs yourself in a particular way. And you could construct yourself in a different way.
Mm.
In ecolinguistics, we're interested in maybe people reconstructing themselves not as separate from the natural world, but as part of the natural world.
Yeah, and not as consumers, but as citizens. So we can see some of these shifts, I guess, in narrative that, yeah, you are not a consumer, you're a citizen. What does it mean to be an active citizen? Yeah, you're not separate from nature, you're part of nature. And what does that mean for your story? Like, what changes about your story when you rewrite the characters a bit? And yeah, using, I guess, the past, present, future tools in storytelling so then we can become aware of our past. We can reflect on the story so far, thinking about the different chapters as different phases in our lives and, like, yeah, the sort of protagonist and what does that character want to do in the story and how do they contribute to a more hopeful future. So I think storytelling is so powerful and narrative so powerful because we are just so used to it throughout human evolution.
Yeah,
Um,
and people say, well, you can't change the past, but actually you can because the past, as we know it, is only a narrative
mm,
because there's been a vast number of events over a vast amount of time, and that any kind of thinking about the past, we have to do it in narrative terms. We have to select our events, and we have to select which events were chosen. We have to select the times that we're focusing on, and all the rest gets jettisoned. And so there's
mm,
so many different narratives we could tell about our society, about, well, ecolinguistics, narratives we could tell about ourselves, and that you can change the past by choosing to focus on different events and link them logically in different ways. And so, yeah, it's not just about changing the future. We also need to change the past. And that doesn't mean that
mm.
creating a false past at all. It just means because stories aren't necessarily true or false, they're just different versions of the world, that we just create a different version of the world that is equally true.
Yeah, and it kind of brings us back to erasure and thinking about all the voices, particularly, we hear this around women, kind of women scientists, women leaders that have been erased from history and putting them back into our narratives and giving them the kind of respect that they deserve for the work that they've done. So I think, yeah, I love that. I think that we can rewrite different stories and narratives about the past that help inform the story that we want to create together about the future.
Exactly. That's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's check out. So I just invite you to maybe just share a final reflection about our conversation together, maybe one thing that particularly stood out to you, or one thing that you'd like to share before we end.
Yeah, well, I think that, what's great about our conversation is that we're thinking about change, about, positive new ways that we can go forward. And that, because you can be very, pessimistic about the way that the world is going. And I think we do need to be realistic about the trouble that we're in as a species and as a planet. But at the same time, there is this hope and this optimism that no matter how bad things get, you can create new stories to live by and make it better than it would otherwise have been. And so let's not get mired in the negativity, and let's create some positive news stories to live by. I think that's kind of emerged from what you were saying.
Yeah, thank you, definitely. And I think the one word that's sort of stuck in my mind, and probably because it's often stuck in my mind, is just slow. And I think reframing slow as something positive, which I do see people working with, as kind of slowing down and really taking the time to think and feel and create together, and acknowledging that kind of change needs to be underpinned. The change that we want needs to be supported by a slowing down, and what we're able to do differently when we slow down as opposed to constantly rush, rush, rush. So I think it's kind of a nice companion to change. So we'll close there. Thank you so much, Arran, for such a rich and insightful conversation. And I'm sure everyone listening will really, really want to find out more about ecolinguistics and how they can apply it to their own lives.
Great. Well, it was lovely talking with you.
You've been listening to the Lost in Language podcast. If you would like further information on the guests and topics explored in this series, please visit creatingmeaning.club. Thanks for listening with us in our search to get to the meaning beyond the words.